You're walking down the street, minding your own business, just out to run some errands. You're wearing a black jacket, running shoes, a baseball cap. You pass the doors of a bank. Suddenly, the bank's doors fly open and a man runs out. A man wearing a black jacket and a baseball cap. You see him run at top speed, disappearing around a corner. Moments later, two policemen burst through the bank's doors, spot you, roughly spin you around, handcuff, and arrest you. It's a clear case of mistaken identity, of blaming you for something you had nothing to do with. It's wrong, it's terrifying, and can lead to all sorts of misery and trouble. You're going to spend some time in jail, have to hire an attorney, spend thousands of dollars to defend yourself against accusations that were unimaginable just a short time before. Sounds awful, doesn't it? Well, similar scenarios play out in health information every day. Something, a component of diet, a blood marker, a lifestyle practice, is wrongly blamed for some health problem, such as heart disease, or skin rashes, or depression. In this episode of the Defiant Health Podcast, let's discuss how, just as someone could be blamed for a crime they did not commit, all too often some aspect of life or health is wrongly incriminated for some unhealthy outcome. But learn to recognize this pattern, and you will be better equipped to protect yourself and get closer to the truth. Now, even though you are minding your own business, so this would be a fictitious, of course, example of misplaced blame, or blaming someone for something they didn't do because of, in this case, mistaken identity. Well, does this happen in health all the time? This happens all the time in health. We've been through a century of misinformation, misinterpretation, much of it unintentional, sometimes intentional, where some phenomenon has been blamed for a health effect, and it sets you on course to do the wrong thing, things that are ineffective, sometimes even harmful. Let's run through. We can't run through all the mistakes of misplaced blame that have been conducted over the past century, but we can at least start to help you recognize the pattern. Because once your eyes are open to this idea of misplaced blame, you're going to start to see that it is everywhere in healthcare, in recognition of the phenomena behind health and disease. Let's take oxalates. So oxalates or oxalic acid is a common component of plant foods. And some people have come to believe that consumption of oxalates in foods like spinach, kale, cocoa have adverse effects, especially development of calcium oxalate kidney stones, which can lead over time to kidney disease, and other effects like binding minerals and causing mineral deficiencies. And problems with oxalate have been increasing dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years or so. Problem. People advocate that the problem is there for oxalates in the diet, and they advocate such things as avoiding all plant foods or following a carnivorous diet and experiencing benefit, relief from some of those effects. The problem here is that the problem is not the food. The problem is not the oxalates per se. The problem is the loss of microbial species in the gastrointestinal tract. We have to accept that as a modern society, ever since the invention of penicillin, the discovery of penicillin in 1928, and the wide proliferation of antibiotics and now the wild overprescription of antibiotics, that has decimated the composition of the gastrointestinal microbiome. One recent study, for instance, showed that 5 days of an antibiotic wiped out more than 1,000 species, many of them beneficial species in the human gastrointestinal tract. You know how many prescriptions are written every day in the U.S. alone? About 650,000 per day. Now, that's not even factoring in the antibiotic exposure we get, say, from meats and other foods, where they're added sometimes by farmers. Even though the USDA has tried to clamp down on that, it's still done in many farms, in many parts of the country. So it's the loss of oxalate metabolizing species, of which there are many, such as many lactobacillus species, many bifidobacteria species. There's even a species called Oxalobacter formigenes that all these microbes together metabolize huge amounts of oxalates. So it's the loss of those microbes. You can appreciate that blame was misplaced on the foods like kale, spinach, etc., that provide oxalates. The real culprit is the loss of oxalate metabolizing species. So the real solution is not avoiding oxalates. It's rebuilding a broken microbiome by restoring those species that consume the oxalates for you. A very similar situation applies to uric acid and gout. High uric acid in the blood, called hyperuricemia, is responsible for a number of problems in health. It's a cardiovascular risk factor. It can cause kidney disease. Like oxalates can be a cause for kidney stones, uric acid kidney stones. And so, once again, the purported solution, the blame is placed on uric acid, but specifically on the content of purines. These are DNA breakdown products in food, especially red meat and organ meats. So people are told that if they've had gout or have a high level of uric acid, to reduce their consumption of foods rich in purines, reduce their consumption of red meat especially, and organ meats. Once again, the problem is not the food. The problem is the loss of species, of which there are many, that metabolize uric acid and cause you to pass it out into the toilet or into the urine. Now, the great thing about this is some species have been extremely potent in reducing uric acid. And even better, when you combine 2, 3, or more of these microbes and restore them to the gastrointestinal tract, you get dramatic reductions in uric acid, likely better than any drug used to reduce uric acid. Now, the ideal in both the case of oxalate and uric acid, we don't yet know what the ideal combination is, but we do know that there are microbes that are very effective in reducing them. It's kind of hard to convey this in talking to you, but take a look at my williamdavismd.com blog, and you'll see discussions about this and the microbes that you can start getting. But even if you don't want to restore specific microbes, a program that helps restore lactobacillus species, bifidobacteria species, and other beneficial species. That includes practices like consuming fermented foods and restoring keystone species. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please follow my conversations where we do things like make Lactobacillus rhodori or Lactobacillus gasseri or Bacillus subtilis yogurts and restore those keystone microbes that begin the process of rebuilding a microbiome that metabolizes these things and prevent diseases from them. Another example, very common example of misplaced blame are food intolerances. It could be to nightshades, could be to FODMAPs, or histamine-containing foods, or fructose-containing foods, or legumes, or people who've had IgG testing for food intolerances and say things like, I can't eat almost any food, but I can only eat a list of 8 foods. That's very unnatural. Your great-grandma had none of this problem, right? It's a modern problem. And the incidence of food intolerances goes way up after a course of antibiotics. What does that tell you? The problem is not the food. It's not the FODMAPs. It's not the nightshades. It's not the histamine-containing foods. It's the SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That is, your exposure to antibiotics and perhaps other factors killed off numerous beneficial species in the colon. With this allowed fecal microbes like E. coli and Klebsiella and Campylobacter, to overproliferate and then ascend into the 24 feet of small intestine. And it's not quite clear exactly how, but that process of colonization of the 24 feet of small intestine by fecal microbes, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, is the phenomenon that leads to food intolerances. There's nothing wrong with the food. There's something wrong with your gastrointestinal microbiome. So we address the SIBO. And we do that in my programs with something I call SIBO yogurt. It's not yogurt. It's a collection of microbes that we ferment for prolonged periods to get very high numbers. And these are microbes chosen specifically to colonize the small intestine where SIBO occurs and are known to produce bacteriocins, natural antibiotics, effective in killing those fecal microbes. You may consume it for weeks to months, but so far it's been working. I have a human clinical trial we're going to be conducting sometime soon to finally prove this works, but I can tell you If it's something that looks and smells like yogurt that you make in the comfort of your kitchen and provides a whole long list of other benefits, there's nothing here to stop you, right? So once again, another instance of misplaced blame, in this case, the food. And the problem is not the food. The problem is your disrupted microbiome. Another example of misplaced blame: high levels of homocysteine in the bloodstream. That's an amino acid that has been shown over the years that when you have higher levels, typically above 14 micromolar per liter, that has been associated with a marked increase in potential for depression, cardiovascular disease, and various cancers. Well, it's known you can reduce your blood level of homocysteine by supplementing B vitamins, specifically vitamin B6, B12, B9, which is folate, and sometimes riboflavin B2. And it's been shown numerous times you can effectively reduce homocysteine levels. Problem: 8 human clinical trials, fairly large trials, have been performed, where participants were given some combination of those 3, sometimes 4 B vitamins, and homocysteine is reduced effectively, typically below 14 micromolar. Yet that has not resulted in a reduction in any of those problems: cardiovascular disease, depression, cancer, etc. So why the departure? Why is homocysteine a predictor, but reducing homocysteine does not result in any benefit? Doesn't make any sense, right? Well, know this: the microbes in your GI tract, once again, the microbes in your GI tract, the good ones that you probably lost, are known to produce vitamins B1, B2, B3, B5, B6, B9, and B12, as well as some other nutrients. So what if homocysteine is really not a result of deficiency of B vitamins in your diet? It's a result of dysbiosis and probably SIBO due to the loss of B vitamin producing species. Now, we need better science here, but I'm going to predict for you, based on what I've been seeing over and over and over, is a restoration of a healthy microbiome in your gastrointestinal tract, including eradication of SIBO, provides the B vitamins for you and reduces the level of homocysteine. There's no harm in supplementing B vitamins, but there's probably no benefit in supplementing B vitamins, at least from a homocysteine viewpoint. Another important example: the beta-amyloid plaque and phosphorylated tau. This is debris that accumulates in your brain when you develop Alzheimer's dementia. The pharmaceutical solutions are terrible. One, they use drugs that are meant to improve memory, and they do a little bit, but they typically don't impact on the progression of the disease. You still get further debilitation, loss of memory, and then loss of independence and all the problems that come with advanced dementia. Well, now there have been 8, to my knowledge, antibody treatments, monoclonal antibodies, biologic therapies that are effective in reducing the beta-amyloid plaque and, to some degree, the phosphorylated tau, the 2 things that accumulate in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. So these drugs do work for reducing those things in your brain. Problem: it appears to accelerate cognitive impairment and atrophy of the brain. In other words, yeah, they do work to reduce that kind of debris in the brain, but it seems to actually make the disease worse. There may be one exception that has very minimal effects on improving memory, but so far they've been a complete bust, despite billions of dollars spent by the pharmaceutical industry by blaming beta-amyloid plaque and phosphorylated tau for dementia. I don't think it's struck a lot of these people yet to ask this question. Now, wait a minute. If we get rid of these things, and dementia gets worse, maybe they're not the cause. Maybe they're a consequence or some associated phenomenon due to something else. And by the way, those something else's have been identified in many cases. It could be sebonendotoxemia that we know provokes deposition of beta-amyloid plaque and phosphorylated tau. It could be insulin resistance. That's a whole other conversation, but we know insulin resistance in the body, in the periphery, we say, leads to insulin resistance in the brain, which is very different than the rest of the body, because when you have insulin resistance in the body, you have very high levels of insulin and glucose. When this happens in the brain, there's a very low incidence of glucose and insulin in the brain. That leads to essentially a starving brain. That's why factors like medium chain triglycerides and being ketotic helps. They're not cures. They're temporary fixes. Please don't hear me say that these are cures for dementia. They are not. They simply improve mentation a little bit temporarily. But once again, an instance of misplaced blame, beta amyloid plaque, phosphorylated tau, blamed for dementia, when it looks as if there are other processes at work, like the insulin resistance, endotoxemia, and some other things. Heavy metal toxicities can do it also, and some other factors. That's where the blame should be placed. And of course, one you're probably familiar with, blaming saturated fat and cholesterol for an increase in cardiovascular disease. Connections that were made in 1950s and 1960s using very sloppy, outdated science before clinical trial design was understood. And so it became the mantra, cut your fat, cut your saturated fat, cut your cholesterol, practices that do not reduce cardiovascular risk. Sadly, that idea led to the introduction of drugs, pharmaceuticals that reduce total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, that also have very minimal effect. The tragedy of all that is the blame put on saturated fat and LDL cholesterol took everyone's attention off the real causes of coronary disease and coronary events like sudden cardiac death, need for bypass surgery or stent implantation, heart attack, etc. The real causes are different. They're things like the production by the liver of very low density lipoproteins, VLDL, that leads to formation of small LDL, insulin resistance, inflammation, portal venous endotoxemia. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please refer to my other YouTube videos, my Define Health podcasts, my thousands of blog posts on WilliamDavisMD.com. And if you need some guidance, some hand-holding, some conversation to help you do this, I invite you to join the conversations in my innercircle.drdavisinfinitehealth.com. So you can see over and over again in healthcare, and this is just a partial list. There's many, many more that we could cite, instances of misplaced blame. So recognize the pattern, and you'll be a lot smarter and more effective in managing your own health, not being exposed to the misinformation and mismanagement of conventional healthcare ideas.